Hi everybody, welcome. We're just taking a moment for people to arrive. Thanks so much for your patience whilst we let everybody in. It's great to have everybody here this evening with us. Just repeating again, we're just giving everybody a little bit of time to come in and join us. You can see our two authors there on the screen. You'll see them in real life in a minute. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. You can see that the numbers are still going up, so we'll just wait a moment longer. Welcome those who are just coming in. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for your patience. Okay, I'm going to say good evening everyone and happy National Tree Week. My name is Sarah Lom and I'm CEO of the Tree Council, which is the charity that brings everybody together for the love of trees. Welcome to our Arts and Culture Festival, which this evening is focused on the world of literature. We're delighted to welcome two amazing storytellers, William Boyd and Victoria Schwab, and a warm welcome too to Caroline Sanderson, who's our chair tonight. The conversation is going to begin in just a moment, but first one very brief item of housekeeping, which is to invite you, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A box, and then at the end there'll be some time when our panelists will be able to respond. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to you, our audience. Thank you from the Tree Council and from the trees. Now it's time to settle in comfortably. I'm going to hand over to Caroline to guide our journey. Caroline is Associate Editor of The Bookseller and the author of 5 non-fiction books, as well as Artistic Director of the Stroud Book Festival. She revealed to me her favourite tree earlier, but I'm not going to spoil the secret in case it comes up in conversation. So over to you, Caroline, to introduce our other guests tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And indeed, a very warm welcome wherever you're joining us from. Now, what a wonderful literary challenge to bring together two eminent and apparently very different novelists and attempt to find some synergies between them and talk about trees as well. Are Victoria Schwab and William Boyd different species of writer? Or do they bark up the same trees in some cases? Haha. Well, let's find out. We'll talk for around 40 minutes and then we'd love to take some questions from you, our audience. And as Sarah said, please do ask these via the chat function anytime while we're chatting, and they will be relayed to me via the wonders of technology. So welcome, Victoria. Welcome, William. The first thing I'd like to talk about, which is, I have to say, one of the particular joys of reading your novels in a time of lockdown, is that they roam far and wide geographically. So The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, Victoria's novel, Paris, New York, Venice, the Cotswolds, where I'm talking to you from, LA, New Orleans. Love is Blind, William's novel before the current one, Trio, Edinburgh, Paris, Geneva, Nice, St. Petersburg, Biarritz, Vienna, the Andaman Islands, and Trio, his new novel set in Brighton and a bit of Paris. So what I want to ask you both is this, would you say this is a hallmark of your writing, and does it reflect your own cross-continental origins? So William, you grew up in Africa, you went to school in Scotland, and you now live in London and France.
Well, I think because I was born in West Africa and grew up there, and I think for a long time I wasn't particularly interested in Great Britain, to be honest. Abroad always seemed much more fascinating to me. So my early novels were set anywhere but the UK. But slowly but surely I've been drawn back, and I've written several novels that are set pretty much exclusively in either England or Scotland or London. I've written 2 London novels, the city I live in. So I did roam a bit at the beginning, but I'm sort of coming back home to my sort of where I live to a certain extent, but I think it all depends on the book you want to write next. I don't have any plan. I don't have any program or model. My next novel, which I'm in the process of figuring out, is going to take me all over bits of Europe. But that just happened because of the story I want to tell, rather than any travel plans I happen to have.
Victoria, you're half British and half American, and your biography says you divide your time between Nashville, France, and Edinburgh. An autobiography I rather aspire to, being a country music fan and part Scottish and a holder of a French degree. You describe yourself as having a wicked case of wanderlust. So in your book, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, you seem to really take joy in all the locations that you visit in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So yes, growing up, I had an intense case of wanderlust, something that I tried to sate over the course of my teen years. And then as an author through my 20s, I had the incredible privilege of getting to travel for work. And so I've always considered setting to be a primary character in my novels, but Addie LaRue is the first time when I've gone to myriad places for the sake of one book. Usually it's, it's London, or it's a fictional setting. It's somewhere that is itself the entirety of the story. It's near, which is a tiny village in one of my books, or it's something almost nuclear in that way. But with Addie, it became a kind of travelogue because I was writing it along the backdrop of my entire career. So I've written 20 novels, and as I was writing every single one of them and promoting every single one of them over the course of a decade, I was traveling and I was thinking, how would Addie engage with these places? And so very rarely was I researching for the sake of Addie LaRue, and more I was just going about my life and she was a passenger. And so this is the first time when I've really looked at settings in a way of not being the primary character, but the entire map, the entire landscape on which to work for a character.
Aha. That's really interesting. So how would you say you go about establishing a sense of place as a writer? And to what extent might descriptions of the natural world be key to this? William, I know that you're a little bit obsessed with the built environment and how to describe that. You're quite precise about things like architecture, for example. What about nature?
Well, I think I like to think I'm very precise about everything. I mean, talking about trees, I always name trees in novels. I never say there were a lot of trees around the house. I always specify the type of tree. And I think that's true of all novelists. You don't just say a car, you say a type of car, or a dog trotted by, you say what type of dog it is. I have this strange compunction to know the names of things, whether it's flowers or trees or breeds of dog or whatever it happens to be. But I think that's a very writerly thing, actually. We're very curious and we want to know the proper name. So when I think it's very important if you're writing realistic novels set in a particular historical period, to make them live and breathe. And so much effort goes into finding the exact detail that somehow brings that world to life, whether it's the battlefields of the First World War or St. Petersburg at the end of the 19th century. I take incredible pains. I study photographs, maps, street maps. I read books that were written at the time, guidebooks that were written at the time, and cherry pick the information I need to give us a sense of the vividness of that place and time. And also, I hope to indicate that I know a whole lot more than I'm letting on. So it's a kind of bluff in a way, because you can't just shovel all your research into your novel. But it is very important to be precise, I think. And the more your detail works for you, the more it kind of resonates out through the story you're telling.
I imagine that's true for you as well, Victoria. I mean, despite the fact that you're a fantasy novelist, that doesn't make it any less important, does it, to establish this sense of place and time?
Not at all, especially because I'm a fantasy novelist in that I write about the fantastical, but I try to always write about the fantastical in a naturalistic way. So my systems of magic or my supernatural elements are always very grounded in physics and science and nature, and making them as innate and intuitive and naturalistic as possible. I'm also a practicing pagan, and so I'm very conscious of the line between the urban and natural world. I'm conscious of the concept of reverence for a natural world. And so I think that's a theme that permeates a lot of my work, is this idea of, you know, whatever you want to call it, that imbues nature with this extraordinary power, this otherworldliness. You know, I think in Shinto, in Japanese Shinto, it's this idea that everything which inspires awe in the natural world is possessed of its own god. But it's this concept of that kind of awe-inspiring element, whether I call it magic in a book or whether it's simply, you know, the tree, Estelle's tree in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It's this idea that everything is possessed of more than it seems, and that everything has a history and everything has a narrative. And so often we think of narratives as things limited to the built or constructed world, when narratives are so possessed of the natural world as well.
Yeah, well, that's obviously very interesting in the context of trees, which we'll come to talk on. We'll talk about a bit more specifically in a minute. And I mean, again, I'm thinking I'm thinking here about what you do with your imagination and what you do through research. I mean, the two things come together very much. So, for example, I ask you whether it's necessary to travel to a place to write about it well. Do you actually have to be in there?
Well, sometimes I do. I mean, I think it's actually quite good to send your imagination instead of going there yourself. And I've often written, particularly at the beginning of my writing career, I got obsessed with certain cities. I got obsessed with Los Angeles in the 70s, Berlin between the wars, Lisbon between the wars, and I couldn't afford to go to any of these places, but I wrote about them all the same. And I actually wrote an entire novel that's set in the Philippines, The Blue Afternoon it's called, and I was planning to go to the Philippines to research it, to go to Manila, where most of the action takes place. But then some volcano erupted in the nearby, and all flights were cancelled. And so I abandoned, not being an intrepid traveler, I abandoned my visit. But I wrote the book with exactly the same method as before. I had somebody doing some research for me, but I had, you know, maps and photographs and street maps of Manila. It was Manila in 1902, in fact. And I sort of virtually, or, you know, in an imaginative way, inhabited that city. And it was very funny because I got a letter from the head of the J. Walter Thompson advertising company in Manila. And they said, I thought you'd like to know, Mr. Boy, that every time we have a new client, we give a copy of your book to them to explain something about the history of our beautiful country. I'd just like to know, when was it that you lived in Manila and where exactly did you stay? So it just shows you don't need to go. It helps if you've lived in the tropics, of course, but I genuinely think you don't need to travel to places to write about them in a completely authentic and plausible way.
Does that ring true for you, Victoria, in terms of the balance between, you know, the research you have to do? I mean, this could also apply to a historical period, of course, couldn't it? That you don't have to have lived through it, or you have to research it, but you have to imagine yourself there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's the really interesting thing. I mean, traveling to a place is a privilege. It's a privilege of time, resources, and fortune, you know, as to the place being available. But if you're writing about any other time but the present, it will always involve a matter of research and imagination, right? Because you can travel to a place in the now, but you cannot travel to that place in person as it was, you know? And so I think it's a combination. I set myself an interesting task with Addie LaRue, which is that I wouldn't write about a place unless I'd been there. But it was places that I had been to over the course of the decade of traveling. And so it was almost opportunistic. I never set out to visit a place with Addie intended. She was something that came after. But I also set myself a challenge, which is that because I knew that my character was going to be visiting a lot of times and a lot of places, I needed to be able to distill any place I visited down to one page worth of detail. And so it forced me to look at what's the specificity of it. if I were to try and capture Prague in a paragraph, obviously you can't, but what do you try to do then? You don't try and picture the entire outline of the city. You try and pick details which can create extrapolation for the reader, which can create extrapolation for the imagination. And so I'm a really big believer in finding the details that almost form the notes of the musicality of a specific place. Every place has a different rhythm, a different song, a different palette to it. And so part of that evocation, and for people, you're evoking it for readers who many of them themselves have not traveled or will never travel there. And so you're creating a fictionalized version, regardless of how accurate you're trying to be, because it's almost like, it's an echo of an echo of an echo in their minds. And so I do try to aim for specificity, though.
I love the way you described it there, the musicality of a place or a time. And but it seems to me you're both doing something very interesting as well, and you're zooming right in on a place at a specific time, but also you've both written novels I'm thinking here of the Rings of the Trees, where there's a wide span of time here too, and how you deal with that within the space of one novel. Your novel, Victoria, spans 300 years, and William, I don't think you've quite done that, but I'm thinking of Any Human Heart, a novel that spans the whole of one man's life, that of Logan Mountstuart, your hero, and that's a device that proved particularly popular with readers. I think that you'd manage to have the whole span in one novel, and I think you're doing that with your next novel. I think I remember reading.
Well, planning to, yes, I call them whole life novels. They're kind of cradle to grave novels, and it's a very small subgenre actually of literature, because even the novels that you think are whole life novels, like say Dickens or Trollope or Thackeray, actually aren't. They're only part of a life, and there's something about writing about a character, whether it's a man or a woman, from when they're born to when they die, that has a very distinct resonance with readers. I think you as a reader, you have all the information in a way that you wouldn't necessarily get from just reading an orthodox novel. And I must say, just from reactions of readers to the whole life novels I've written, and I've probably written 4 of them altogether, it's slightly different. There's a sense in which you know that character in a way that's different from the way you know characters in novels you read, however much you may love that novel. You've got the whole roller coaster of their life, and I think that subtly changes the way you, the reader, react to that person. So it's a challenge, of course, and it's a challenge of elision, because if you write a whole life, you might end up writing a 3,000-page novel. So it's a question of where do you cut and how do you bridge the bits that you tell, and so there's a lot of technical expertise required in getting a whole life into even 500 pages.
Yes, do you recognize that when you think about Addie, Victoria?
Yes, I mean, it's a 300-year life, and I think the page count depends on which country's edition you're looking at, US or UK, but we'll say 550 pages. Yeah, and again, I think not to repeat myself, but it comes back for me to the specificity of the details, in that, like, it is, as you say, William, it is about elision. Then it is about deciding what to include and what not to include, and understanding that what is left out is going to speak as loudly as what you include in that case. And so, yeah, it takes a vast degree of intentionality, especially because I very much wanted to keep Addie LaRue as short as possible. I wanted it to feel ephemeral and ethereal. And in order to do that, I didn't want it to be a 1,500-page novel, which it could have easily been in different writers' hands with different preferences. I wanted it to be right about 500 pages. I wanted it to feel like it could slip through your fingers a little bit. But yeah, it was a grand task then to pick which years to visit.
Yes, and yet, as you say, make it feel ephemeral, because of course our heroine is a woman who everybody forgets, isn't she? So And while we're on the subject of time, what about the time that it actually takes to write a novel? Now, William, I know I'm lucky enough to interview you before when Love is Blind was published, and you said to me that, and you said in quite a few interviews actually, that each novel you write is about 3 years in the crafting. So that's 2 years researching usually and a year to write it. Although I think Trio might have been slightly quicker than that. Am I right?
Yes, I'm speeding up as I get older, actually. But I have for a long time a kind of rhythm of 3 years per novel. But I'm now sort of speeding up to sort of 2.5 to 2 years a novel. I think because I can sense time running out, you know, and I've still got many stories to tell. So. But every writer is different, and every writer's method is different. And I don't like to start a novel until I know how it's going to end, and it can take a long time to figure that out and to think about it. And sometimes I often write the end of the novel before I go back and start writing page one. I like to have a destination, and I don't write particularly quickly. But if you know where you're heading, you've got no excuse for not working is very important. No procrastination allowed, but also it gives you a certain confidence that you don't have to scratch your head and think what's going to happen next. But I know this is not true for many novelists. Some novelists just start writing. Some novelists start in the middle of their novels. But I have this long period of invention, as I call it, period of invention, which once that's complete and once I've figured it all out, then I enter the period of composition and write the thing. And that takes usually about 9 months to a year. But I've spent often twice as long, you know, pondering and researching and traveling and reading and filling notebooks and so on and so forth. But, you know, chacun a sa méthode, as they say in France. And it works for me, but it might not be any good for another type of novelist.
I do find it absolutely fascinating, and I love hearing novelists talk about this. I know Lee Child is one of those who says that he does, on a specific day, he sits down at his computer and just has no idea what's going to, I guess he knows who the character is, but Victoria, I know that this isn't quite what you do. You've described writing a novel as an adventure, and yourself rather wonderfully, while we're speaking French, as a bricoleur. Tell us about that.
Well, I will say I am very much in the vein of William here, that I never start writing a book without knowing how it ends. And mostly because everything I do is in the interest of preventing myself from quitting. And I feel like if I have an ending, it takes the vast desert of a first draft and turns it into a football field. It's a specific amount of distance I have to cross, but I can see the end. So on good days, I'm excited to get there. And on bad days, well, I won't quit because I have the work set out. It's just a matter of crossing a specific distance. But I've had books, you know, that said, how long it takes me to write the book depends in large part on how long it takes me to find the end. And I've had books where I have found the ending that excites me in 6 months. And I've had books where I found the ending that excites me in 6 years. Addie LaRue took 9.5. But that was 9.5 from idea to finished work. So 10 by the time it was published, which is the longest anything's ever taken. Usually average for me is about 1.5 to 2 years, but my book, the book will be late if I don't have the ending. The only time a book has ever been late for me turning in on a contract was because it took me too long to find the ending, and I can't start without the ending. And I need to know, I think the ending is the taste left in your mouth. And if you're not sure what you want that to be, I don't think it's as satisfying. So I used to do an interview series called No Right Way, where I specifically interviewed authors about the way that they create, the idea being there is no right way to write. But I do confess, I'm completely flummoxed by authors who can just sit down and stare into the void and just explore without the fear of wandering 50,000 words in the wrong direction. My anxiety does not permit me to do that. I need to have confidence in what I'm doing. And then the execution takes about 6 months.
Yeah. Well, I suppose if you are a genre writer and you have the confidence of a character and a lot of novels behind you, perhaps that's something that helps. But what do you think it was about Addie that took the time? I mean, it's quite a big concept novel, isn't it?
Yes.
This.
Well, it's interesting. It probably should have taken me about 6 years. but I became really precious about it. I became, you know, it was an idea that wasn't under contract. I didn't owe it to anybody. I had other books that I did owe, and I became protective of it. And something happened between years 5 and 8, I would say, where I became afraid of writing it wrong. And I became so afraid of writing it wrong that I didn't write it at all. And then it was about 8.5 years into actively not writing this thing that I loved, because it wasn't apathy. It was the exact opposite of apathy that kept me from writing it, that I realized I was just going to die without ever writing this book. Like, in the interest of writing something perfect, I was going to write nothing. And that's no way to get a story out. And so I had to get to the point where I could accept that all stories are inherently imperfect, and that there's always a chasm between the idea in your head and what ends up on paper. The goal is to make the chasm as small as possible. I always like to say, I love metaphors if you haven't been able to tell that. And I always like to say that the idea in your head is this beautiful crystalline orb filled with light. It's perfect, it's spherical, it's flawless. And the idea of writing that story down is smashing that crystal orb against the nearest wall. And then the act of revision is slowly gathering the sphere back together, cutting your hands up, just trying to make it glow a little bit again. And there's always something lost. There's always an efficacy lost between the thing in your head and what's on paper. And I was not willing to lose something. And so it took years and years for me to come to terms with that loss. And then the process of actually writing this novel was especially fraught, because I was just so desperate to get that glow back. And I will say that it's the only one of my books that I've ever written. And I love the books that I've written, but I've accepted them for what they are, not what they could have been in my head. Addie was the first time when I felt like I got close to the thing that was in my head to start with.
All right, so I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful novel. It's a kind of feel the fear and do it anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, so the thing about you, William, is that you have had to revisit quite a few of your novels quite some time later, because you've written so many screenplays of your novels. So what's that like? I mean, do you ever come back to them and think, oh, I'm not sure that I bits you might want to change, for example? I mean, I know a screenplay is an entirely different thing anyway.
Well, I think I totally agree with Victoria about getting your ending right. And I think that if you operate in that way, the novel you write, and my experience certainly, is pretty much the novel that I had figured out. And so I don't think there are any runts in the litter, particularly. I'm pleased with all my novels over the years, but adapting them for film or for television series is a huge change of mental gears. And because I think the two art forms are very, very different, and you're bashing the square peg of the novel into the round hole of film. And the reason why they're so different, I'll keep it as simple as possible, it might even seem almost a stupid remark, is that film is photography. Everything is seen through the lens of a camera. Therefore, film is massively, ruthlessly, relentlessly objective. And of course, the novel is effortlessly, seamlessly subjective, as well as being objective. And I've, having done both, and I've directed a film as well, moving from the world of the novel, which is a world of, you know, absolute freedom, where you can do anything you want. You then move into the world of film, which is a world of parameters and compromises and frank impossibilities. You just can't do certain things on film that you can do in a novel. And so when it comes to adapting a novel, it's actually quite straightforward. You just think, what will work on film? And it's very apparent what won't work. And that tends to be what gets left out. And it's usually around about 50%. Film adaptations just cannot deal with the inner life of characters in the way that the novel can. And the tools you have at your disposal as a screenwriter to penetrate, to access the inner lives of character are remarkably crude compared to what the novel offers. So I think it's like a totally different world, and totally different industrial conditions apply. And if you understand them, then the process of adaptation is, you know, relatively straightforward. Trying to make a film like a novel is doomed to failure. You have to try to make the best film you can.
You're smiling in recognition there, Victoria, I think. And We should just say, I mean, I'm interested to hear whether you have ever written with the idea of a film adaptation in mind. I know William has said that he doesn't do that, but and I think there's a Netflix series forthcoming, isn't there?
Yes.
One of your stories.
Well, I was smiling in recognition because I wrote the film adaptation for Addie LaRue. So it was my first time writing a feature script. And so I'm learning all of these things that William is talking about the hard way here. But I was smiling because as somebody who faces a great degree of self-doubt, the one thing that I love about screenwriting adaptation over the novel is that the screenwriting, like the script is a living document. To your point, William, that it's going to be interpreted and filtered through a lens. What I love about that then is it makes the words themselves in the descriptors functional, but slightly less fraught for me, knowing when I write a novel that every word that I'm writing is going to be seen by a pair of eyes and interpreted directly. While there's an immense freedom to the budget and the constraints, there is also an intense hyper awareness of the words that I'm writing. And sometimes I can get a bit stuck in that. I can get caught up in that exact wordage. Whereas sometimes when I write scripts now, I get really excited because I know that I'm trying to create an interpretable document for several layers, whether it's the actors and the director and the showrunner, all of these things. So I think it's fascinating. He's completely right. You're completely right, William. They're just completely different art forms.
Yeah, and the script is, it's true, a script is so many things. It is a narrative, you know, you're telling a story. It's also a document that will help them budget and schedule. It's also, though many directors might not agree with me, it's also a set of instructions on how this film should be shot. And so a film goes through so many different lives. A film script goes through so many different lives in its life. But there's something slightly pragmatic and utilitarian about it. And I don't know if you found this, Victoria, your writing style changes. You can't be as verbose and as florid as you might want to be. So you tend to kind of hone your style down, becomes very punchy, very to the point, because it's photography, and you can't go on and on. You can't spend 10 minutes with a character having breakfast, so it's a very, very practical and pragmatic way of writing. And you have to, as I say, you have to shift these mental gears in your head and adapt for this new world that you're about to enter.
Well, I mean, it's quite an achievement to do that. If you have started off as a novelist, I think there's a lot of novelists who've sort of thrown in the towel and let somebody else do it for them, aren't there? So you're both well, William, you've done it many times, and you're grasping that nettle, Victoria, at the moment. It's really, really interesting. So I do want to come on to talk about trees a little bit more specifically before we go to questions in a bit. So as I think we touched on before, there are lots of evocative descriptions of trees in both your books. And at this point, I have to say a big thank you to Sarah Lom for giving me exact page numbers, because I guess when you're CEO of the Tree Council, you really notice it when writers put trees into their novels. So Victoria, there's a lovely description of very early on in your novel where Addie, who is born in this small village in France, is at the end of the 17th century, is rebelling against her novel, against her marriage that's being planned for her. And you write that she would rather be a tree. If she must grow roots, then she would rather be left to flourish wild instead of pruned, would rather stand alone, allowed to grow beneath the open sky. So talk a bit about trees and what they mean to you, and when you in your writing, is it something that just comes into your head, or is it something that you're keen to? You talked about being a pagan earlier, so
Yeah.
tell us a bit about that.
I think thematically, trees have always been quite meaningful. I mean, everyone has like their ideal environment, right? My mom would always rather be by the seaside. My dad loves the mountains. I'm happiest in a forest. And I think there's always been something that's felt on the line of the metaphysical for me. And I think part of it is that a lot of my work deals with mortality, with the idea of life and death as this very hard divide. And I think so much of the supernatural element of my work is trying to create something porous out of that boundary, or something cyclical And obviously the beautiful thing about nature is the cyclical aspect of it too. But I remember picking up a book on trees probably 10, 15 years ago, and being mesmerized by the details of nature and their applicability to the human condition, from the idea that a seed can, stay in certain species up to 2,000 years before deciding to sprout and is only vulnerable once it does, to the idea that certain trees can communicate with each other, to this concept of, obviously the rings and the age and the longevity. And I think it's not that I'd ever want to live forever, but I'd be quite happy to live as long as some trees do. And I think it seems like such a perfect, proud manifestation of nature in that way. It's just something I've always just felt incredibly aligned with.
William, I wondered about whether you had any particular memories of trees from an African childhood. I mean, coming from Africa to Scotland to go to school, and I think you're visiting family as well, the contrast between those, and maybe talk a little bit about what trees mean to you now. I picked up an essay of yours in Bamboo, which is a collection of your essays, where you write about oaks and where you live in France, being surrounded by dense oak woods. And you say, this year I'm planting 50 oak saplings, and the next year and the next. This was in 2004. So be good to get an update on that as well.
I have planted a lot of oaks, and I become very interested in trees. I mean, I grew up in savanna country in Ghana, but then we moved to Nigeria into tropical rainforest, which in some ways is so in your face in a natural sense that I became very aware of the kind of physical nature of living in what was sort of jungle in a way. But I started, my eyes were opened by a wonderful writer called Oliver Rackham. And Oliver Rackham was an expert on British forests and woodlands. And I must have every book he's written. He's also an extremely good writer. So even though it's very scientific and it's to do with the nature of the historical nature of woodland and so on that he writes about, it's a very evocative way of getting into what trees mean to the landscape and their potential. And I was struck by him. You remember the great hurricane of 1988, where millions and millions of trees were felled in Britain. Oliver Rackham wrote a letter to the Times saying, "This is a good thing." That kind of woke me up, because he said we have too short a view of trees and the life of trees, and that if we didn't cut down a single tree within 200 years, the whole of Britain would be covered in forest again. So it's quite remarkable to get a scientist's view of these amazing pieces of vegetation that we take so much for granted. And so my small contribution in my little corner of France has been to encourage the oaks to grow as much as they can. And I won't see the final effect of it, but I am sort of creating not a forest, but a kind of mini wood around our house, and so far so good.
What do you, would you say, we have a climate crisis, and I wondered what you think, if anything, fiction writers can do to influence people, apart from maybe distract us from the kind of horror of what's going on, Victoria.
Well, I think specifically it's interesting to ask that question to a fantasy writer, because I think often we think of genre, fantasy and science fiction particularly, as being separated from reality. But the truth is they're often commentaries on reality. There are a vast number of science fiction and fantasy novels that engage in the climate crisis, that paint futurism, that examine roads that are potentials for us to go down. But also, fiction is its own awareness. It's almost like my mom used to, it's the broccoli and the mac and cheese. It's the idea that you can create an awareness of the world around you and some of the, the serious matters through a metaphor of something that's entertainment, right? Especially, I write for children and teens as well. I write for children, teens, and adults, and having that installation of awareness early on as to this idea that you are connected to the world in which you live. I write characters that are intrinsic to their environment, whether they run counter to it philosophy wise. You know, I believe that our world, as I said earlier, is a main character, is, you know, setting as primary character in a novel. What you're doing then is teaching the reader that they're characters that they love, that these people that they supplant themselves into for a time don't exist separate of their environment. We are a product of the environments in which we are raised. We have the potential to change those environments just as much as we have the potential in fiction to change the politics or to change, you know, the future in any capacity. It's really important to write worlds in which our characters are born out of the environment that raised them and have feelings about that environment.
William, you describe yourself as a realistic novelist. Does any of that chime with you?
Yes, I think you know, that I once said the last thing you know about yourself is your effect. And, you know, W.H. Auden, the poet said, you know, poetry makes nothing happen. And I'm not sure that's true. And I think you can't tell what your effect, the effect of your book will be on anybody. Or I don't think we're, you know, particularly effective at motivating political movements. But if you write sincerely about the human condition and what you write strikes a chord with your readers, then you are having an effect in one way or another. And I think it's impossible for any writer not to somehow incorporate their essential beliefs about the human condition in the fiction they write. And so readers will take stuff away from your books, and you cannot tell what that effect will be. It is there, I think, but it's not. If you're trying to write a message, then maybe you should write a manifesto rather than a novel, because it's what's implicit in a novel that's important rather than what's explicit in terms of attitudes and political stances and so on. I think if you read all my novels, you'd have a pretty clear idea of the kind of person I was, but that's not why I'm writing the novels. But as I say, I think it's something that will happen whether you want it to or not. And sometimes I've been stunned at the effect of some of that my novels have had on certain readers, completely counterintuitively. So I think that, you know, things will happen, and powerful fiction, meaningful, intense, you know, fiction can, you know, change people's opinions, inspire people, make them think again about their lives. So it's quite a profound ripple effect, but you can never tell how far those ripples will go or precisely what effect they will have on the people they touch.
Now, I want to move to some of the questions that have come in just a moment. So we've got time for them, but just picking up on that one final question before we do. I think I've had a lot of novels talk about, you know, I interviewed Ali Smith once, and somebody asked her about what she thought a particular bit of her novel meant, and she said, it's for you to decide that, you know, once I've written the book and it's out there, it belongs to you. And that sort of seems to chime with what you're saying. But I wanted to ask you both, and again, we could with your wonderful, better at metaphors than me, I think, Victoria, but just thinking of the rings of a tree and thinking about, I wanted to ask you both what you would say are the preoccupations which run through all your work, like, say, the rings of a tree. What would you say, Victoria?
Death. But again, like mortality being a porous concept, I grew up really terrified of death, not my own, but everyone that I loved. And so I think what I sought when I first started writing was comfort and wish fulfillment. And my version of wish fulfillment was a version of death that wasn't permanent or wasn't as frightening. And so I look at my earlier works, and they are a concept of, you know, of death as a porous boundary to what's next, or as the ability to reclaim space from death, or as a library of the dead, or superpowers that emerge from a near-death experience, whatever it was. In my Shades of Magic series, it's two characters being bound together. One resurrects the other and ties him to his own life force. And it's this idea of these tetherings. And I do think that, you know, mortality and the desire to see it portrayed in a cyclical way instead of a linear way is something that permeates all of my work.
William?
Well, I think in my case, and this is the with the wisdom of hindsight, I look back at my books, and I think fundamentally they're making the point that life is all about luck, good luck and bad luck. And there's actually not very much we can do about that. And that the aggregate of a person's life is all the good luck he or she has had and all the bad luck. It usually winds up, about 50-50, but you can see there are some people where the scales are weighted one way or another. And I find that quite a consoling philosophy, in fact, because if we just don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We think we do, but we can be proved idiotically wrong. And I think if you advance into the void that is the future with due caution and prudence, very aware of the fact that the dice could be rolling in your favor or against you, you actually savor the present moment all the more, and your present happiness, however much, whatever that consists of, it can be very modest or it can be very exhilarating, but you savor it all the more because you realize it's so incredibly fragile. And I think that's what I've constantly underneath my novels has been, this sense that we're all walking on very thin ice, so we should take great care about our next pace, because we don't want the ice to crack, we don't want to fall through, and if we're lucky, if our good luck is operating, then that will be the case. But we all know there's bad luck out there as well, so just be careful.
Right, now I'm going to really, if I'm look like I'm looking down at my phone, that's because that's exactly what I am, just to see what questions have come in. So, question from Jules Acton. What are the author's favourite mentions of trees in literature? You've talked about Oliver Rackham, William. Anything else?
Yes, there's an extraordinary book. I was actually asked to adapt it for a film, and it's by Italo Calvino, the great Italian novelist, and it's called The Baron in the Trees, and it's a kind of what would you say? It's a kind of allegorical novel, but it's about this young man who gets very angry and says, "I'm going to spend the rest of my life living in treetops." And so he climbs trees and he never comes down again. So it's a very curious book, almost impossible to adapt as a film, but it stayed with me. And something, Calvino had this idea about a boy who climbs a tree and never comes down again. And so I think that's probably in literary terms, the most striking tree novel I can think of at the moment.
Victoria.
I'll recommend it because I finally remember the title of the book I was referencing earlier, which is a nonfiction, but it's a memoir, and I find it to be incredibly powerful. It's a scientist named Hope Yaren, and the book is called Lab Girl, and it is essentially an examination of the natural world and mental health and identity and crisis through the foundations and the allegorical lens of nature and botany. And I discovered it in my mid-20s, and it changed my life. And it's one of the things that made me far, far more aware of nature.
Interesting. I'm desperately trying to think of a children's novel that I remember reading to my son, which is set in trees, and I'll try to remember what it's called, but it is really wonderful. Perhaps somebody will put it on the chat and remind me. A question from David Carey. Do the writers have any childhood trees that influence their lives?
Well, in talking about my African childhood, I remember the frangipani trees vividly in our garden. And there were these incredible pines that you get in Africa called casuarina pines, which are very tall and very kind of flimsy looking pines. And they often line seashores. In fact, it's palm trees and pine trees in Africa. So my memories of Africa, as far as trees are concerned, are, well, there's the flamboyant tree as well. I have very vivid memories of the trees I grew up surrounded by. And I think probably those images are the ones that resonate most throughout the rest of my life.
I moved around quite a lot, and it was something my parents did every time we moved somewhere, was that we would plant trees. And I could always tell how long I'd been in a place based on how tall the trees got, because we planted them when we first moved there. And I would sometimes go back and visit previous homes that I'd had to see the trees, but I will always remember the one tree that we didn't plant, which was in the backyard in San Jose, California, when I was quite young, that was a tangerine tree. And it was so big that it filled the entire backyard. And we could just, it was the first time, it sounds so foolish, but like as a child, it's the first time I realized that I didn't have a garden before that, right? I didn't have something that produced fruit and vegetables. And so to be able to reach up and pick something from a tree and consume it in that way. And now I'm 33 and I'm living here in France with my family on lockdown, and they have a fruit and vegetable garden with a little orchard. And still the greatest small joy, I think a lot about this year, that we don't really have very many big joys, but we can have small joys. And my greatest small joy this year has been tending the gardens and being able to pick apples and peaches and things from the trees. And, you know, mirabelles, which are these little yellow French plums that grow here, and things like that. I love the concept. I love the being able to engage with nature in a way that I tend it and it tends me.
That's interesting. It's one of the, for me, it's just being, you know, anywhere sort of Mediterranean, being able to do that is, I remember once staying in a place in Turkey with ripe pomegranates on the trees, and it just sort of blew my mind. It was like I'd been entered into the Arabian Nights or something. It was just wonderful. And then we have a question from Jess Fern, it's sort of, I suppose, slightly similar, mainly for Victoria, but William, you might want to contribute as well. Do you have a favorite forest, having mentioned that forests were your place? And Jess says, I love your book so much.
So my parents knew they wanted to retire to France. And so every year for about 10 years, we would travel to different parts of France. And one year when we were traveling in Normandy, we went to a place called Welguet, which is in kind of the Celtic region, or sorry, not Normandy, in Brittany. And the most amazing thing about Welguet is it has this forest in which the scale of everything feels off. So these massive boulders that fill the center of the forest, and you feel like it's a fairy place. You feel like it's the kind of place where giants came and flung about these stones and they land, like everything has this extraordinary scale, and you walk up for a mile, 2 miles, and you just come upon a little bookstore at the top, like just set in the middle of a field. It's one of the most magical, if I could design an environment. But Welguet, which is spelled like Huelgoat, it's like a Breton word, was again one of those things that just made me believe in magic if I hadn't already. It was one of the strangest, most surreal, most beautiful pieces of nature I'd ever moved through.
Sounds extraordinary place. You've just sort of got your own home forest.
Yes, I think there are two landscapes which are very wooded and not so much forest. But I mean, there's our family home in Scotland was next to a little tributary of the Tweed called Manor Water, and I think I knew 2 or 3 miles of the Manor Water, which wound through woods and was very overgrown, as intimately as I've ever known any other landscape. And in our house in France, there's a very big oak wood right at the back of the house, which is called vinegar wood, actually, the bois de vinaigre. And I also know that piece of land extremely well. And it is actually very magical because the oak trees are gigantic and 100 years old, and it's an ancient wood. And I've got a map, a pre-French Revolutionary map in the 1780s, where vinegar wood is actually listed on it. So it is a magical place, and it's ancient and very unspoilt. So these are the two landscapes that I think, if I have to summon them up, are the ones that come immediately to mind.
And a question for me, again, they're all related, but that's just come through from the chat as well. And it's probably a very good tree on which to finish. And I saw that Sarah from the Tree Council was on the Tree Council's website. She mentions that the hornbeam is her favourite tree. And I've said the beech because it's my favourite walks in the Cotswolds are through beech woods. But also I have a bit of a penchant for really ancient yew trees, you you talking about Scotland reminds me when I was very small of going to Fortingall, which is just near Loch Tay, and could not believe that this tree was 3,000 years old. I mean, I couldn't get my small head around it. So, so just wanted to ask you both, if you had to pick a species of tree, which would it be?
Well, I think in my case, I mean, I love all sorts of trees, but I think the one that that seems to me particularly evocative is the silver birch tree. It's again very Scottish, but it's also very Russian. And when I see woods of silver birch, or even in London, around the corner there's a silver birch planted in the pavement. It always makes me think of Russia and the particular Russian writer I absolutely revere, Anton Chekhov. So I'm still steeped in Chekhov, and I think he is I use this word very, very rarely, I think he is a genius, Chekhov. And somehow the silver birch always makes me think of Russia and Chekhov, and that's quite a nice feeling to have.
It's weird because I'm surrounded by trees all the time, and yet I almost never see here in this area my favorite, which is a ginkgo. And it's because specifically of fall, it's specifically the way that the leaves turn that flaming yellow and then all fall off all at the same time, it seems, and create this incredible, almost unearthly puddle, like a perfect circle around the bottom of the tree where all the ginkgo leaves just form this beautiful yellow, just a butter yellow pool. And
I just took a photograph of that just the other. There are a lot of ginkgo trees in London. It's funny you should mention it, Victoria. Exactly that effect. I was pavement outside a shop in London. I saw all these yellow coins. They're like coins that had fallen from this tree. So I just snapped it. So I know exactly what you're saying.
They just drop off the tree, and for some reason they all drop at the same time, and so you end up with just a blanket.
And they have a lovely shape as well, the ginkgo leaf. So no, exactly. It's you're a very good point there.
Oh, that's given me a new appreciation for the ginkgo. Thank you both so much. That really enthralling conversation. I hope that you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I think we found some surprising synergies there. Writers, like trees, I think, are a communal species. It's sharing many of the same attributes and nourished by many of the same sources. I thoroughly recommend The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and also Trio. This is William's latest novel, and also Love is Blind. This is my proof. It doesn't look quite like that, but those are the ones we've talked about. I really don't think you can go wrong with any book by either of them, though, actually. So thank you for joining us, and I'll hand you back to Sarah for some closing thoughts.
Oh, thank you. Sadly, we have come to the end of tonight's conversation, which has traveled around the globe, which has embraced a whole world of trees, has traveled through time. It is sadly time to say farewell. A huge thank you to you, William. Thank you to Victoria, and thank you to Caroline. You have really truly connected us tonight in a really fantastic way. We're hugely appreciative of your support. And can I suggest to those who are listening that one of the books, or many of these books that we've discussed, would make a great stocking filler or a present under the Christmas tree, either for yourself or for one of your loved ones. So do think about that. They are absolutely extraordinary storytellers, these two people. Thank you to you, our audience, who've spent the evening with us. I hope you'll join us again soon. We've got lots more events coming up. We have Sam Lee, who is from Singing with Nightingales, who is actually singing from the top of trees for us. We have unmentionable bakers from very famous baking programs who will be entertaining us one evening. And we also have a sofa chat with Tracy Chevalier and with Jonathan Drury on the sofa together, literally in their home in Dorset. They'll be joining us as well. And we have Cumbrian farmer, shepherd, James Rebanks, talking about his new book, English Pastoral. So really great session, but incomparable tonight, absolutely amazing. Thank you, and stay in touch, and goodbye, everybody. Thank you very, very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Victoria.
Bye, William.
Lovely to
Thank you
meet
very,
you.
very much.
Nice to meet you all.
Bye, Sarah. Bye. Bye, Caroline.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Caroline.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
I don't think we're alone yet, so we still have participants who are leaving. I can see that we still have 14, 13 participants with us.
Well, I'll bid you farewell. Thanks,
Yes.
thanks for asking
Thank
me.
you so much. We will speak, no doubt, very soon.
Yeah,
Hugely, it was wonderful, just really fantastic. Lovely to see everybody so relaxed. So thank you. That was down to you.
Thank you.
Bye.